Topolino to Istanbul, 1966, Part 2. This 1934 photo shows the prototype Fiat 500 with its designer Dante Giacosa. The production version was introduced on the 15th of June 1936. It was initially named the Zero A, but before long the public had named it the Topolino. This was the Italian name for the Walt Disney character Mickey Mouse, and the name stuck. It was the smallest car in the world to be put into mass production, and in various versions over 500,000 were built. The Topolino comic started in 1932, and others are still in publication. This 1951 magazine cover is typical. The familiarity of the amusing character explains why we and our car were laughed at from one end of Italy to the other. Maybe it also explains why, although the car is relatively easy to maintain, we never saw another one in Italy. Being laughed at every appearance can become a little wearing. This part 2 of the road trip starts with us reaching Rome and found the recommended campsite, Roma Camping, which turned out to be excellent. For a few days we became tourists again and visited all the suggested sites. At the Spanish Steps we splashed out and bought big ice creams. Unfortunately, Roz dropped the top off her ice cream, but when the seller saw the distraught expression on her face, he kindly gave her another one. Having had enough of sights and museums, we eventually set out for Naples. On the journey we passed sandy beaches and lakes. It might have been beautiful on a sunny day, but Wednesday the 13th of April was dull. Much of the coast was desolate, and most of the buildings were little more than shanties. By the time we got to Naples, it was getting dark, and narrow roads were choked with people out for an evening stroll. Luckily, we soon found a campsite, more expensive than Rome, but better than sleeping in the Topolino. In the morning, we found that the campsite was actually quite good, so we spent a lazy day washing our clothes and checking the car, etc. On Friday the 15th of April, we drove on into Naples. However, everywhere we thought of parking, people came up to us and warned us of thieves. On every street corner, young men were leering at Roz, and before long she retaliated by poking out her tongue or making faces. We were not enjoying Naples, but on the way back to camp we went through an area where they were repairing vehicles in the sort of way I appreciated, cutting new treads on tyres, welding up rusty chassis, and fixing up old engines and gearboxes. We stopped, and I ended up helping some guys fix a tow bar to a decrepit Fiat. They were interested in Topolino and gave me a spare ignition coil. Back at camp we saw a German chap cooking on a petrol stove. He noticed our interest and later came across. We spent ages discussing the advantage of petrol stoves and decrying the people who were frightened of them. We'd found Naples dirty, noisy, crime-ridden, and not for us, so on Saturday we decided to travel on and have a look at Vesuvius. Soon we reached a sign saying that the route ahead was blocked by roadworks, so I left Roz in the car and walked some distance down the road to examine the situation. Meanwhile, Roz was besieged by a crowd of urchins. She started to drive on, but the urchins clung to the car, and there was danger of running them over. When I came back, I chased them away, and a chap suggested a diversion. This turned out to be a rough track, but we eventually reached a good campsite close to Vesuvius and set up the tent. We decided to leave the Topolino and walk, but a friendly Italian gave us a lift to where the road ended and the clouds began. He regaled us with his recollections of previous eruptions and cooking spaghetti on the hot lava of 1944. The mist cleared and there were fantastic views of Pompeii, Sorrento, the bay and out to Capri. Back at the camp it was almost all English, plus a few Germans, but it was a relief not to be pointed at and laughed at all the time. The next day we drove to Pompeii and did the touristic bit again. It was only a short distance to Amalfi and Positano, but on the way we passed a disused quarry. It looked a good place to set up camp, but before long a few other cars began to arrive, and we began to realise that this was a favourite place for courting couples. It was getting dark, but suddenly I could just make out someone hiding amongst the quarry rocks about 50 feet above us. I gave him a wave, which made him dart back out of sight. As night approached, the other cars gradually departed, and eventually we were left alone. Our electrics gave us no possibility of driving on. Uncertain of what happened to the observer meant that putting out the tent was out of the question. We didn't feel very secure in our ragtop Topolino either, but got into our sleeping bags and settled down for the night. We joked about see Naples and die, but then a small rock tumbled down the quarry face. Probably goats, we said, but I slipped my 8-inch Bowie knife into my bag. In the morning we were still alive, so the guy was probably a peeping Tom rather than a psychopath looking for victims. The drive round the Amalfi headland was spectacular, with the road clinging to the steep cliffs, which fell straight into the sea. We passed Sorrento, but stopped at Positano to buy some apples and gaze at the view. And at Amalfi we became tourists again. Let's go on, shall we? Had become our oft-repeated phrase. The next stop was Salerno, where we visited the ACI office, Automobile Club d'Italy, and bought some ice creams. We decided not to go down to the Tour of Italy, but to cut across to Foggia and travel up the east coast. The road began to climb a range of mountains, and we couldn't find anywhere to camp, so slept in the car in a lay-by. Of course, the next day revealed lots of camping possibilities. Our route headed in the direction of Cervignano and became steep and twisty with lots of hairpin bends. It was very hot and we needed a campsite, but after traversing a very bad road we found the Paradiso, an excellent campsite at Pescara further up the coast. In the morning we walked into the town and watched the boats in the harbour. Some Italians befriended us. They had an Alfa Romeo which they were very proud of, and gave us a noisy lift back to the campsite. They wanted to talk about football and the World Cup, but they picked the wrong couple. Over the next couple of days we worked our way up the east coast, but didn't stop at Ansona. Too many sunbeds and sunshades. All the coastline seemed to be privately owned. A friend had raved about Rimini, but to us it looked like Blackpool. Our next destination was Venice, but we had heard that the best place to camp was Punta Sabbione. This required passing Venice and then driving back along a spit of land the other side of the lagoon. It was worth it. The campsite was very good, and reaching Venice by ferry meant that approaching it from the sea was much better than coming in via the industrial mainland. One of our memories was the Cock-a-Doodle, an early riser which had never mastered the final do of nursery rhymes, cock-a-doodle-doo. We spent 6 days exploring Venice. Eventually the road began to entice us, and we were ready for off. Before we could leave, I had to repair the exhaust pipe. This was done by wrapping the corroded part with a tin can and securing it with a couple of Jubilee clips. Another Jubilee clip was to be our saviour later on. The Topolino proved very difficult to start, possibly owing to the oil having drained down from the bores, but after about 20 energetic turns of the starting handle, we were relieved to hear it spring into life. We set off about midday, and soon the country became more green and we started to see mountains again. We found a good campsite, Obelisco Camping, at Villa Opsina, about 1,000 feet above Trieste. There was a panoramic view of the harbour, and we went for a walk to have a look at the villa. When we returned, there was an army of super-sized ants crossing the campsite, but the route just missed our tent. The next day, Saturday the 30th April, we took a tramway down to the city. It was an important dock rather than a tourist city, but there was an ACI office and we had our last Italian chocolate ice creams before stocking up on oranges and general supplies. Sunday was the glorious 1st of May, an appropriate day to enter Yugoslavia, our first communist country. At the Royal Radar establishment, both of us had to sign the Official Secrets Act. It was a couple of years since I'd left the Royal Radar establishment, RRE, but Ros was still there until just before we left, and her father was a principal scientific officer working on military airborne radar. Before she left, the security officers had somehow heard of our plans and called her in and gave her a stern pep talk. As it turned out, the border was most casual, and they hardly glanced at our passports. We changed $50 into dinars, bought some petrol coupons that gave us a preferential rate, and we were through. There were lots of pictures of Tito and flags for the Labour Day celebrations. We could have cut across the Istrian Peninsula, but decided to stick to our plan of following the coast wherever possible. We gave Pula a miss, but decided to have a look at Rabas. This turned out to be a good move. The road down to the village was steep, but there was a campsite. It was closed, of course, but we were able to put our tent right on the edge of the beach. It was an idyllic spot, just the sort of place we'd hoped to find. The next 4 days were spent snorkeling, exploring the nearby village, or walking on the hills. If you have a high-resolution screen, you should be able to pick out our tent as an orange dot through the dip in the rocks. Some years ago we went back to have a nostalgic look. What a change! Hotels and holiday flats everywhere. Behind the beach is now highly developed, with even a large swimming pool. No longer the romantic stop that we remembered. No doubt to some people's taste, but not ours. On Thursday the 5th of May, we set out on our road trip again. The scenery was beautiful, with forests, hills and inlets like fjords. We reached Rijeka at 11 a.m. It was the largest port in Yugoslavia and looked it. Smoky pollution and shipbuilding. However, there were supermarkets and we were able to easily replenish our food stores. This included tins labelled corned beef meat, which turned out to be very good. Nothing seemed to be imported from England or America, except books by Tennessee Williams, which obviously met approval. Continuing along the Croatian coast, it became very rocky and desolate. The few villages we saw seemed hardly populated. There were more donkeys, scraggy sheep and goats than people. As we reached Zadar, we saw a few cows and houses built as holiday homes, children who waved, and old men with droopy moustaches. The road was listed as the Adriatic Highway, and it was very good, although in view of the drops could have been provided with better crash barriers. Vertical cliffs fell straight into deep water. However, since the Topolino cruised at 35 miles an hour, we felt quite safe. There were small harbours and islands. In one place, to our surprise, we saw a saltwater duck. Otherwise, the coast seemed almost deserted. As it was getting late, we reached a place called Starigrad, with an excellent campsite which for once was open. It was possible to put up our tent almost on the water's edge. Starigrad should not be confused with Starigrad on the island of Hvar. Friday, 6th of May. Spent the day swimming and making model boats from driftwood. We sent those sailing off into the distance. The following day we set off for Zadar, where we did some shopping. A policeman stopped us. Apparently we had infringed some traffic law. Luckily we just got a telling off, which we didn't understand anyway. However, it rather took the shine off Zadar, and frightened that we might get something else wrong, we decided to head off for Trogir. The campsite in Trogir was closed, but we had a look round the town. It was very attractive and more our size, so we decided to stay and found a suitable camping spot in a small pine wood. Unfortunately, it started to rain heavily, but I managed to get the tent up after a fashion, using only 4 pegs. We crawled inside and were pleased to find there were no leaks, and for the first time we cooked inside the tent. On the 8th of May we were up early, but it was still raining. We had a look round Trogir. It was an attractive walled town on an island, but not at its best in a persistent drizzle, so we decided to go to the cinema. It was a pretty simple film, with a bearded villain who had a passing similarity to me. On the way out I was pointed at and giggled at, presumably due to my beard. Monday 9th of May we were woken up by a Balkan band, and decided to press on to Split. On the way we saw the band again, and took an out-of-focus photo. Split was busy, throngs of young people and modern music. There was an open campsite, expensive but we decided to stay. In the evening we walked back into the town. A dance hall seemed to be the centre of attention, so we went in. A jazz band was playing old American numbers, plus Beatles songs. As usual, Roz's long black socks and my beard were sources of amusement. We talked to various young people, but it started to get rowdy with too many drunks, so we headed back to camp. Tuesday, we decided to divert inland and have a look at Mostar. We took a wrong turn, which took us over a pontoon bridge. By the time we realised and returned, the bridge was open, so we had to wait 20 minutes for it to close again. Soon after we joined the correct road, I noticed a vibration from the right-hand wheel. I jacked up the Topolino. The wheel nuts were tight, but the wheel could rock up and down and side to side. The problem seemed to be the wheel bearings. Luckily, we had a drawing of the axle assembly and could see that they were taper roller bearings. I removed the split pin and tightened the adjuster nut until the wheel was stiff to turn. Then I slackened it off a bit. The wheel spun smoothly and the wobble was gone. It was a mystery. I could see no reason why it had suddenly become loose, but I reinserted the split pin and we set off again. I should probably have dismantled the assembly and re-greased it, but decided to leave well alone. The road was bad, with lots of potholes. In one area, rudimentary houses were on one side of the river, and the farmers crossed to their fields on the other side in simple canoes, which they paddled American Indian style. We decided to stop overnight, but couldn't find a suitable site, so pulled up at the side of the road. It was raining, so decided not to cook and feasted on chocolate biscuits until we felt sick. We spent a hellish night sleeping in the car, and in the morning, Wednesday 11th of May, the rain had stopped, so we cooked a meal of tinned goulash. It consisted of saucisson, tripe, and some sort of pipes with beans. It sounds awful, but it wasn't too bad. A woman in dirty, ragged clothes, herding some sheep, stopped and stared at us. We gave her some chocolate biscuits, which she wrapped up carefully and saved. This was the poorest region that we travelled in so far, and we pressed on. On arrival at Mostar, we found that we had to pay to park. This was the first time on the journey, and it came hard. It was very touristy, with lots of knickknacks for sale. After a good look round, we crossed the famous bridge and took some photos. In the subsequent war, the bridge was destroyed, but it's been rebuilt in the same style. After Mostar, we carried on along the road to Dubrovnik. We kept seeing signs telling us how far it was to the traject, but not knowing what a traject was, they weren't much help. The Dubrovnik campsite was expensive, but we needed a good stop. It was raining again, and in our walk round the town we saw very few people. To cheer us up, we bought a cheap bottle of crème de menthe and drank a good part of it. The following day we explored Dubrovnik without the rain. It was too touristy for us, and every other person seemed to be English, so we decided to move on again. After a few miles we stopped and spent another night in the car. Not quite as bad, since we'd found a way to recline the seats a bit. On Friday the 13th of May we reached the traject, which turned out to be a ferry that avoided us needing to take a long excursion around the Bay of Kotor. People on the ferry were saying that it was going to be replaced by a bridge, but now, almost 60 years later, the traject is still a ferry. It's somewhat more advanced than the 1966 one, but a great improvement on one of the first ones. After some miles we could see Seti Stevan below us, but decided to give it a miss. After Petrovac there was a long climb, but the road was good. When we came down the other side we reached a large lake with lots of small fishing villages. Eventually we reached Titograd. Before World War II it was called Podgorica, but the name was changed in honour of the wartime leader Josip Broz Tito. We expected this to be a large modern town, but in fact in 1966 it was very small, and we were through it before we realised. However, we did have the sense to fill up with petrol. After the fall of communism, this part of Yugoslavia became Montenegro, and in 1992 the town regained its old name. It's now the capital of Montenegro, and has become the modern city we imagined. Here we had to abandon our approach of following the coast. Straight on was Albania, which we couldn't enter. This meant heading up into the mountains to reach Pristina, and then east to reach Greece. Our rudimentary map didn't inform us that it meant crossing the Kekor Pass, 1,844 metres, the second highest pass in Yugoslavia, and was somewhat notorious. Now looking at the map more carefully, I can see in tiny figures 2483, but that refers to the nearby mountain. The road followed a very blue river which had a deep-cut gorge. Looking down, we could see a steam locomotive on its way north. There were lots of tunnels, but all went well until near Kolasin, when we broke a rear spring. This was serious. I jacked up the Topolino, and after examining the situation, I came up with a plan. The brake was in the top leaf, about 6 inches from the rear suspension point. Luckily, the next leaf stretched as far as this suspension point and curved slightly around it. At this point, a local guy turned up. He didn't speak English, but soon grasped the problem and was eager to help. I had a large tyre lever about the same width as a broken leaf. Together, we forced everything back into the original position, laid the tyre lever over the brake, and secured it in position with clamps made from pieces of Dexion and long bolts. Dexion was a sort of large Meccano, pieces of which I'd fortunately brought with us. It saved the day. Amazingly, it lasted the rest of the trip. Rather pleased with ourselves, we shook hands and set out again. It had taken us several hours, but as it began to get dark, we found a good place to camp at the side of the road. In the morning, we discovered that we were practically on top of a couple of houses. Some men looking very foreign rode by, and we took a photo. 2 boys arrived on their way to school. They could speak quite good English and were eager to try it out on real English people. The road began to deteriorate, and we had to stop to repair punctures. We climbed through mountains, hairpin after hairpin. Ros began to feel sick from petrol fumes. I realized that the bad road was sloshing the petrol in the tank to the extent that petrol was escaping from the petrol cap. I took several small polythene bags, made holes in them, fitted one inside the other, inserted these improvised baffles into the top of the petrol tank, and secured them with the cap. This solved the fumes problem, but it was to lead to a different problem later on. We carried on for a few miles, but suddenly we smelt petrol again. But this time it was running from the bottom of the petrol tank onto the floor. Initially I thought the tank had split. Fortunately this proved not to be the case, but even so it was serious. The compression nut that held the delivery pipe to the carburetor had split. As soon as I realized this, I was able to stop the flow by turning off the tap. That gave me time to think. At home it would not have been a problem. Remove the pipe, unsolder the olive, remove the broken nut, slip on a replacement, and then solder the olive back on again. However, here, halfway up a mountain, and with no spare nut, it was not going to be so easy. Then I remembered that amongst my bits and pieces was a small Jubilee clip. I slackened off the compression nut a couple of turns, found the Jubilee clip and fitted around the broken nut. Tightening the clip screw, I was able to bring the 2 edges of the crack back together again. After doing up the assembly finger tight, I tightened up the clip as far as I dared, and then gave the assembly a further tightening up with a pair of pliers. It was not beautiful, but when I turned on the tap it seemed to have done the trick. In fact, it lasted the rest of the trip. The problem had probably been caused by the shocks and vibration from the terrible roads. However, just to check, I examined the engine mountings to see if they could have been a source of excessive movement, but all seemed okay. We were on our way again. Lorries had cut deep double grooves, but we protected our exhaust by always spanning just one of them. As we neared the top of the Caicor Pass, we were overtaken by 3 lads in a British long-wheelbase Land Rover. At the top they were waiting for us. We were presented with cups of Lipton's tea, provided by one of their sponsors. They are from the King's School, Canterbury, and were on a trip to Afghanistan, returning through Russia, somewhat better financed than us. Some years ago I contacted the school to see if they managed to complete the journey. One of the masters sent me a newspaper article headed, "They saw 21 countries in 11 weeks. Apparently it went like clockwork." After the head of the pass it was alpine, with primroses, cowslips and crocuses. This didn't last. We soon reached the Rugova Gorge, cut through the mountains, one of the deepest gorges in Europe. The road followed the river, with lots of tunnels and precipitous drops, before winding down to Pesh. It was very Turkish, men with turbans and baggy trousers. On the way we passed a small monastery and mosques with minarets. In this picture you can see the mountains that we had just travelled through. There were lots of people out for an evening walk, and as usual we and our tiny vehicle were surrounded and laughed at. There was a small campsite, the only other occupants being some Australians. The next morning, Sunday the 15th of May, Pest didn't look so mysterious and interesting, so we headed out towards Briesen. On the way we stopped to talk to a couple of Americans on a Harley motorbike. They'd been to Egypt, Turkey and Greece. A shepherd turned up and offered to swap a sheep for my Rolex watch. A bit further on we stopped to eat some lunch, but we were nearly run over by a herd of stampeding bullocks and just managed to get away in time. After Briesen the road started to get bad again. The petrol smell returned, but this time the source was a crack in the fuel gauge assembly. The road got worse, with a long hairpin climb, and then down through a narrow valley with river, road and narrow gauge railway running together. We passed children trying to sell daffodils, and as it started to get dark found a place to camp near the road. I repaired the fuel gauge assembly with araldite epoxy, and it had all night to cure. In the morning a crowd of local children surrounded the tent, so I went out to talk to them with snatches of English and French. Then they realised there was someone else in the tent, and waited for her emergence with anticipation. A shepherd arrived and told us that there were bears where we had camped. We pressed on and soon reached Skopje. There were still lots of signs of the 1963 earthquake, which had killed over 1,000 people and destroyed about 80% of the city. We talked to 4 English lads hitchhiking to Australia and spent the rest of the day fixing things and sorting out our money in preparation for Greece. On Tuesday the 17th of May we visited the Puknik to try to change our excess dinars back into US dollars. They told us to go to the bank. At the bank they said they would only change back what was left after we'd spent 3,000 dinars a day. We were told to spend the rest on souvenirs, but we made such a fuss that eventually they gave us our dollars to keep us quiet. Flushed with success, we tried to change a few Italian lire, but they'd had enough, and we had to leave. Midday we set out for the Greek border. This is the end of part 2. In part 3 we enter Greece and reach Athens. I become ill through drinking contaminated water. More bad roads, one of which has to be cleared with a bulldozer. More breakdowns and difficult repairs. We encounter a private army equipped with brain guns and rifles, and notice our photo in a newspaper.